In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 5, Part 1, where in our last video we went over consumer preferences. In today's video, we will go over utility by setting up some preliminaries to then discuss utility and conclude by revisiting indifference curves. Beginning with our preliminaries, currently we are seeking to develop a framework to explain how consumers make choices, where we will need to answer how consumers rank choices as well as what are the possible choices available to our consumers. Where at the moment our attention is in how a consumer ranks their choices, where we saw in our last video a consumer will order their choices based off of their preferences. So then now we need a way to measure these consumer preferences. This will be done through utility and is a measure of satisfaction for using leisure time and consuming goods and services, where a unit of satisfaction will be referred to as a util, where some key properties of utility will be that more is better, and that there's diminishing margin utility, or that more is better, but each additional unit of a good is not as good as the last unit of that good. Or in terms of margin utility, this is going to be the change in utility by consuming one more unit of a good, and we can think about this as the slope of the utility function, that is the rate of change of utility. So then, to give some context to utility, let us motivate this discussion through example, where in our discussion of preferences, we had a consumer going to work out and face different choices of pre-workout and whey protein to use. So let us now suppose for our discussion of utility, the consumer finished their workout and is going to the grocery store to purchase quantities of ground beef and brown rice for a post-workout meal. To begin this analysis of utility, let us suppose that the consumer is consuming a fixed amount of brown rice and is varying their quantities of ground beef that they are consuming. This will allow us to examine both utility and margin utility graphically, where utility is on the right and on the top, utils is on the vertical axis, ground beef is on the horizontal axis, and below that on the right we have margin utility on the vertical, quantities of ground beef on the horizontal. So then let us now begin this discussion. By not consuming ground beef, no satisfaction is provided to the consumer. So in terms of utility, we can represent this with point A. 0 ground beef consumed, 0 units of utils, so 0 satisfaction. If the consumer decides to consume an initial amount of ground beef, this will bring them some satisfaction by being closer to full. And we can represent this with point B on our utility graph. Consuming a positive quantity of ground beef provides them a positive quantity of utils, so some satisfaction. And in terms of the difference of eating and not eating, this provides a positive quantity of utility. So in terms of margin utility, a positive quantity of ground beef generates some positive margin utility as a result as well. Now, in terms of consuming further amounts of ground beef, this will bring some satisfaction to the consumer, but not as much as initially eating, since they are not as hungry as before. So in terms of utility, we represent this with point C, further amounts of ground beef, further quantities of utils, so further satisfaction, and in terms of its rate of change, or the slope, or margin utility, since more is better, we have a positive quantity of utils provided, but since it's not as good, or this places us in terms of margin utility is a point that is positive, but strictly below point B. Now, consuming even further quantities of ground beef will bring further satisfaction, but not as much, since now the agent is either closer to being full or they are already full, such that this ground beef will now serve as extras for another time period. How we represent this in terms of utility is additional amounts of ground beef, providing additional amounts of utils, which we see with point D. And since going from C to D is not as satisfying as going from B to C, and definitely not as satisfying as going from A to B, how we represent this in terms of margin utility is that the utility that we granted this consumer, or this consumer got granted by consuming, will be positive, but it's going to be strictly lower than point C in that it's not as satisfying as consuming this amount, and definitely is not as satisfying as consuming the initial quantities of food that B provided. So here we have a downward sloping margin utility graph that is positive as a consequence. So some things to observe in terms of our utility and margin utility graphs, where we can now observe this too in terms of our table representation, is that as more ground beef is consumed, utility increases, where we can see this with our upward sloping utility graph, which also lets us see more is better. And in terms of our table representation, ground beef goes from 0 to 3, and we see that utils is increasing from 0 to 3.46 as well. Additionally, total utility as a consequence is going to be the highest with the most amount of ground beef. Point D, so 3 ground beef, 3.46 utils, which we can also see clearly, point D is the highest in terms of our graph. And in terms of its rate of change or margin utility, each unit of additional amount of ground beef provides satisfaction, so it's positive. So we see that margin utility in terms of our graph everywhere is positive in terms of the vertical and horizontal axis. And in terms of our table representation, going from A to B, B to C, and C to D, going from A to B, utils is going from 0 to 2, so margin utility is 2, that's positive. Going from B to C, utils is going from 2 to 2.82, so the difference between those two, 0.82, we also see is positive. And going from C to D, 2.82 units of utils to 3.46, the difference between these two is 0.64. This also generates us positive margin utility. But we also see that it's not as good as the last unit, where we see we have that downward sloping margin utility graph. And in terms of margin utility in our table representation, we see margin utilities declining from 2 all the way down to 0.64. And this is a consequence of the law of diminishing margin utility, or that margin utility of a good declines as more of it is consumed in a given time period. And as a consequence of this, margin utility is going to be highest at its initial point. So in this case, point B, 1 unit of ground beef, providing 2 in terms of margin utility, which we can also see evident in terms of our graphical representation. So with the ground beef considered, let us now repeat this analysis in terms of holding ground beef fixed and examine satisfaction and additional satisfaction received when the consumer is consuming varying quantities of brown rice. Or now in terms of our graphs, in terms of utility, utils on the vertical, brown rice on the horizontal, margin utility on the vertical, quantities of brown rice on the horizontal, where we have the same story. Not consuming brown rice provides no satisfaction, as we see with point A. Initial amounts of brown rice will bring satisfaction, as we see with point B in both utility and margin utility. Consuming further amounts will bring satisfaction, but not as much as before, as you see with point C in both terms of utility and margin utility. And lastly, consuming further amounts will bring some satisfaction, but not as much as before, since the consumer is either close to being full or is already full, as we can see with point D in both utility and margin utility. Or in terms of our observations of utility, margin utility, and our table representation, we can also see, as we saw with ground beef, as more brown rice is consumed, utility is increasing, which we see with our upward sloping utility function, so more is better. And we see in our table representation, more brown rice, the amount of utils is increasing as a consequence as well. So a result of this then is total utility is highest with the most amount of brown rice, which we can see with point D on our graph. And in terms of our table, 3 brown rice, 3 units of util, or 1.73 units of utils, the highest in terms of our table. And in terms of the rate of change, each additional amount of brown rice provides satisfaction, but not as much as the last unit. And so in terms of seeing provide satisfaction, in terms of our graphical representation, we see positive amounts of brown rice, and we see positive amounts of margin utility, but not as satisfying we see with our downward sloping margin utility graph, where we see in terms of our table representation, margin utility is positive throughout. We're going from A to B, B to C, and C to D. They're going from A to B, the difference in utils is 0 to 1, so margin utility is 1. From B to C, utils is going from 1 to 1.42, so the difference is 0.42, so positive but declining. And to go from C to D, 1.42 units of utils to 1.73, the difference is 0.31, so less than 0.42, so we have positive but declining margin utility in our table representation as well. And this further shows us the law of diminishing margin utility. So then, as a consequence of this, margin utility once again is going to be highest at this initial point, or in this case is point B, or 1 unit of brown rice, granting 1 unit in terms of margin utility. So then, now that we've examined both brown rice and ground beef in terms of utility, How can we look at both at the same time in our discussion of utility? The answer is going to lie in our indifference curves, where brown rice is going to be on the vertical axis, quantities of ground beef is going to be on the horizontal axis, and we also have a table representation as well, where a combination of ground beef and brown rice will yield a level of utility. As we see with our table, 1 ground beef, 1 brown rice, 3 utils, 2 ground beef, 1 brown rice, granting 3.82 utils, and 3 ground beef, 1 brown rice, granting 4.46 units of utils. Where all the combinations that yield the same level of utility, a consumer will be indifferent towards. So with this in mind, this allows us to relate to our discussion of indifference curves. We're here with point A, the 1 ground beef, 1 brown rice, granting 3 utils. This indifference curve is going to be all the combinations of ground beef and brown rice that provide the consumer 3 units of utils. So then, if these are all the options that provide the same level of utility, being on a different indifference curve will represent a different level of utility. Or in this case, being on a higher indifference curve will represent higher utility, as we can see with point B, where with 2 ground beef and 1 brown rice, this provides 3.82 utils as opposed to 3. And we can see in terms of our point, it's above our initial indifference curve. And so this generates indifference curve 1, where this is going to be all the combinations of ground beef and brown rice that provide 3.82 utils to the consumer. And in terms of point C, 3 ground beef, 1 brown rice, more is better, so it provides 4.46 utils, which is greater than point B and A in terms of its utility levels. So this generates a higher indifference curve for the utility level of 4.46, where other combinations such as point D will be, which grant 4.46 utils, or in this case, this combination of 2 ground beef and 2.65 units of brown rice, where the consumer feels the same amount in terms of point C, the 3 ground beef, and the 1 brown rice. So then with this in mind, if we turn our attention towards an individual indifference curve, where once again brown rice is on the vertical, ground beef is on the horizontal axis, an indifference curve provides the same level of utility throughout. So then in terms of movements, we have seen that to obtain more of X, some of Y must be given up to be indifferent towards in terms of the consumer. And now we know that this means to have the same level of utility or the same amount of satisfaction, which allows us to restate the marginal rate of substitution as the rate at which an agent will exchange X for Y and have the same level of utility or be indifferent as they were before. Or if we were to look at this in terms of our graphical and table representation on the right, we can look at this by going from point A to B and B to C, where we see this rightward movement corresponds to the consumer wanting more ground beef, and in order to have the same level of utility, or in this case 4.46 utils, they must give up brown rice along the way. We're going from A to B. This is going from 2 units of ground beef to 3 units of ground beef, and in order to do so, the consumer is going from 2.65 brown rice to 1. So the amount of brown rice that they must give up in order to obtain 1 more unit of ground beef to remain on the same level of utility or the same indifference curve is 1.65. And to go from point B to point C, that is going from 3 units of ground beef to 4 units of ground beef. We see that the consumer is going from 1 unit of brown rice to 0.46 units of brown rice, or that the amount of brown rice that they are giving up to remain on the same indifference curve or have that utility level of 4.46 is 0.54.